I finally caught up. Like
did
this week, I've been
Because you're on holiday.
because I don't listen to any. Obviously don't listen to the ones I'm on, but like I caught up on. I went back like probably listened to 10 this week because they're not actually that long when you're catching the train and stuff. So I listened to Lee's. I didn't know you were on this week, but I listened to your one yesterday. So well.
I feel like we're already started.
Well, Amanda set a high bar, so I've got to.
You think so?
Yeah, Amanda did a great job. So I've got to raise my game. It's good.
That's right. Well, it's
Yeah,
good.
yeah. No-
It's like competition in a football squad.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you don't.
You could keep your
I
spot.
can't get lazy. I can't get lazy.
Can't switch off. Well, we're back on the Chip Lunch podcast.
Woo.
After a momentous episode 100 last week. Did you enjoy that, Braden?
Yes, massively enjoyable. It's fun to
Did you say massively, or-
celebrate that milestone with Lou. It was very fun.
Yes, it was. Good guest to have. Longest
Yes.
podcast ever on the Chip Lunch podcast.
Yet.
2 minutes 16, I think it was.
Yeah.
2 hours.
I was like 2 minutes. Wow, shortest podcast. we've
Yeah,
ever
that's
had.
right. We did bite-sized podcast.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Sounds worth listening to.
Yeah, it was. It was really good. Also, with a beautiful background of orange
Yes.
and green.
Yes.
Welcome back to the podcast, though, Lee.
Good to
More
be here.
orange and green this week. Wrong island flag.
Oh yeah, that's
bad.
dangerous.
That's my
That is
bad.
dangerous
Yeah,
territory.
you didn't pick up on the cues from the last one,
No,
did you?
no.
Some,
Nah, yes. Yes.
Well, you've got
That's right,
Irish,
northern.
Irish background,
Yes.
so that's
yes.
probably what you were thinking
Yes,
of.
my long orange beard left yesterday, but
Yeah.
still
Left?
repping.
Like you
Well,
trimmed
I got
it?
rid of a lot of it. Yeah.
Oh, did you? Okay,
yeah. And that's all right. I don't get offended. And
that's
Oh,
good.
thank you.
I've been living away from Northern Ireland now for more than
That's
18
what we
years.
said. That's what I said in the last episode.
You're Australian now.
18.
That's right. Eight.
18. I was
Yeah.
listening to your last episode just to
That's good.
prepare for this one. I was in the car. I had to drop someone at the airport this morning, and on the way home, I was like, 88.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
And then I was basically trying to repeat what you were saying.
It's all
Josh.
all in the
You said
files. Face.
your son Josh.
Yeah.
Josh. Anyway, sorry.
Or you say face, place, taste. You
Face.
just don't move your mouth.
Face,
Yeah.
place. No, it's
Face.
Aye, so you
I'm
want to
moving
move
my
it
mouth.
because you want to go face, place,
Face.
taste.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're good at that. You're very good at that.
I enjoy it. Face. Is that better? Face.
I think
You
nothing
can't move your
makes
mouth, you're right
you-
about that.
Your vowel movements need to
Yeah.
kind of change.
Nothing makes
Your
you
vowel, not your
recognize
bowel
your
movement.
own accent like someone else doing it poorly. Like it's
Yeah.
like
Oh,
once
really?
once there's an American doing an Australian accent in a movie or whatever, you're like,
Yeah.
oh, we
That's
don't
awful.
sound like that at all.
Well, when you travel, when you're like traveling in Europe or America, you can pick an Australian accent out. Like you hear it and you're like,
Yeah. Well, if you go back to some of the old school, like pre 9/11, every terrorist pretty much in a movie was Northern Irish, and it was somebody putting on a really bad Belfast accent.
really?
Wow.
You know, and
Yeah.
so we always balked at that.
Yeah.
Americans
Except for,
trying to be Northern Irish.
Air Force One. You've seen Air Force One with Harrison Ford? Yeah, that's Gary Oldman, but he's like doing a Russian accent.
That's right. That's right.
And then
yeah.
there's a bit where he goes, they said, you said you were going to let us go. He goes, forgive me, I lied.
I was thinking, there's some movie with Sean Bean where I think he's a
Oh,
Northern
Sean Bean.
Irish bad guy. I'm trying to remember if it's a James
Yeah.
Bond movie or something like that.
Yeah, I can't
remember.
Yeah, no,
Something.
he's in a James Bond movie.
yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
Anyway, Lee, you're back on for part 2. And I was going to say, you've been traveling around a bit. Do you want
Yeah.
to tell us why that was as an intro to this episode?
Yeah, because I don't think we talked about what I do for work in the last podcast.
Good segue.
No.
So I now work, since February this year, work as the Director of Partnerships for MTS, Ministry Training Strategy, which is an organisation that's been around for about 40 years plus. And our vision is to see the world, Australia and the world, one for Christ by multiplying gospel workers through ministry apprenticeships. And we've seen, I think, by God's grace, 3,500 odd apprentices
Wow.
over the last 40 years. Many of them have went into gospel ministry. But the conviction really is that if we want to see the world one for Christ, then we need to equip the saints we need to equip the saints to present and proclaim Jesus to the people around them. And the way that we do that is through this gift that God has given to the church called gospel workers, who will do Ephesians 4:11 and equip the saints to grow up into maturity and do the things that has been set aside in advance for them to do. So my job is to basically help us partner with more churches so that we can see more gospel workers to help us reach the 24 million people who are lost outside of Jesus. So that's what I do for work. And this last little bit of the season has been recruit season. So there's been lots of conferences filled with people who are considering gospel ministry, or somebody else has brought them along because they think that they should consider gospel ministry. And it's really just a G up to go, here's the biblical vision. And normally those conferences as well have lots of equipping, but also helping people work out how to take the next step. So I've been in Adelaide, Melbourne. I'm going down to Melbourne in a couple of weeks for another one as well. So that has taken me around a little bit to places in Australia that I've never been before. And it's exciting. It's awesome to have conversations with people who are considering gospel ministry and encouraging them to do that. So
yeah, that's cool. And you've got a bit of a story to tell about that as well. So it's helpful. Like you've been doing something similar over your life. So that's pretty fun.
Yeah, 100%. And I was a very reluctant participant in a sense. Like when I think I said in the last episode that when I became a Christian, it was like a no-brainer for me to want to share the best news that I've ever heard with whoever would listen. And but I didn't really see God's place for the church in that. Like I didn't grow up in church, became a Christian later on. I had no idea that the church was this beautiful bride of Christ, even though it's not perfect. But as the bride of Christ and as the people of God, we're to be the people who proclaim and present Jesus. Like we're the primary vehicle for the gospel actually going out to the world. And I didn't really grasp that when I had become a Christian. It took quite a while. So it wasn't until 2008 that that's right, 2008, that I really, that a bunch of things, just the penny kind of dropped for me, and God showed me that direction, and I ended up in gospel ministry working in a church as a youth pastor, much to my surprise.
I think, as you said, you couldn't think of anything worse than becoming a pastor in the last episode.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that was just because like what I saw, particularly growing up in Northern Ireland, was, this very straighty 180, middle class, very educated person who just seemed distant to the people around them and in the community, and a lot of that would have been true, but a lot of that would have been just wrapped up in my own prejudice. I grew up in a housing commission area in Northern Ireland, and anybody who had, like one car on the drive and didn't live in a housing commission area, that they weren't the enemy, but it was, you felt that distance between them. So
You've
there was
got
a
more
lot
than
of
us,
that's right. So there were a lot of hang-ups that I had that were just my hang-ups, that prevented me from doing that. And now I'm a white, fat, middle-aged, middle-class kind of bloke, and I'm all of those things that I kind of once balked at, which is funny.
You mentioned what was I going to say? Oh gosh, now I just completely forgot the question. Oh, not realizing that it's like that kind of universal church kind of thing. I was going to ask you both you guys, is that something? I think that's something that I didn't realize until later as well, becoming Christian. Do you think that's something that we didn't grow up in Christian families?
Yeah, I think I had a very narrow view of what, like, I resonate with Lee in terms of like not connecting. The church was something distant, or it was something very small, and I didn't really connect that with gospel ministry. That was like, you go to church, like you go to Miranda Fair, like you go to a sport game, like that. The people who go to church are the people who belong to that church. Like, I didn't really think of it as like a missional kind of thing.
And it's a spiritual thing too.
Yeah. And I think it took a little bit of time for me to figure out what that role of how a church can work in a community, especially.
Yeah, I think I agree. And I reckon maybe because we come from like individualistic, or the society and culture saying like it's an individualistic background.
Yeah.
And then, you go to church, and I reckon the first maybe 10 years of me being a Christian was like just about me a lot of the time. Like and what I was getting out of it, and I didn't maybe sometimes miss the piece of something we even talked about at planning day last week was when you step into serving, it just it really gets more into that realm of what you're talking about, Lee, of being part of the universal church, whether you're in like your local church or the worldwide church. You're doing something spiritual together.
Yeah,
I think that's the thing that I missed.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, like I agree. I think we're profoundly individualistic. I think we're consumeristic, even if we don't think we are. And it doesn't matter if you're a boomer or like a Gen Z or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that's true. And the other thing is too, we're as Australians, we're extremely skeptical of the institution.
Oh,
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's increasingly becoming more so. So I think when you're younger, you're more skeptical of the institution and authority figures and whatever as well. But yeah, the spiritual reality, I think we get confused by local, like universal church language.
Yeah.
The spiritual church and the local church as well. But so that confusion is not something that people can articulate, but we see it playing out week in and week out because we tend to undervalue the local church. I think that contributes to a lot of church hopping and things that we that we see because we go, well, it's just all one big church, and it kind of is.
Yeah.
But every time, pretty much, bar a couple in the New Testament, it's talking about the local church.
Yeah.
That is the main place where all of those spiritualities play out, really. And you only got to talk to somebody who's had bad experiences at church to know that there's something much bigger going on than just something that you consume, right?
Yeah. That's
because
right.
when they get hurt, that hurt is deep and it's real.
Yeah, it is.
And although that sounds strange to go to a negative there, but I think the reason why that's so hard for people is that there's so much more going on than just pulling up for a Sunday.
I completely agree with you. Yeah.
And like on the flip side of that, like coming into a church and only knowing the institution from the outside, the thing that struck me first was the people.
Yeah.
Like being like, oh wow, there's people here, and they're great. Like, and that really struck. I really resonate with what you're saying there, Lee.
Yeah.
Is that's what struck me first, was coming from that outside perspective of viewing church only as an institution and not really sure about what it was, but then walking in and meeting people first, and you're like, oh wow, like cool. Yeah.
And people have been transformed by the gospel is what makes
absolutely.
a big difference, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that the thing that I got actually when I was at Engadine Congregational Church was a real sense of, like, this is something that Australians, I think, do particularly well. We're a lot more relaxed around this whole church thing compared to many other countries in the world.
It's not as formal?
It's not as formal.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit more of a come as you are kind of approach. There's a little bit more realism around who we are and what we're doing together. But I think that because of that, the flip side is that we undervalue what happens when we gather together on a Sunday or when we gather together in a small group. I think we miss actually the spiritual reality of what's going on, because it's a beautiful thing. Like we don't just rock up, we're a family, we're a group of, you know what I mean, Soul Revival, like friends language. I like family language, but the reality is when we gather together and when we go to a local church, we're covenanting together. There's something profound in that reflects Christ's relationship with the church, and so it's really deep and important, I think, for God's mission in the world. Yeah, we're going away off on piste, aren't we? Or
that's all right. This
off piste.
It's fun.
Yeah.
It was fun to
doing
talk about that.
Ecclesiology podcast.
Yeah. Well, it's probably a good point. So maybe we can return to your story, because as I said, I listened to your last episode again. Or was it the first time I'd listened to it? Actually, I'd been on it, but it's because we kind of went through a whole time of coming all the way up to Australia. So if you haven't heard Lee's podcast, like life story prior to that, go to part 1, which is The Only One in the Room, is what we titled it, because that was something you said when you were at a funeral. I think that's when you became a Christian. You felt like God was only speaking to you.
Yeah, that was the first time when I was in church, so
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was the start of that journey.
Yeah.
There was
So this is the Only One in the Room part 2. And so by now you're in Australia, and we talked about how you started going to church and became a youth pastor. And then we talked about your family. And one thing that I wanted to just bring up, your youngest Ava, I feel like just by her hair, she looks like she's from Frozen, like in the Frozen movie. Every time I see her, I think, oh, it looks like Elsa.
Yeah.
No, is it Elsa? Yeah, she looks like Elsa because she's got the blonde hair. Yeah.
Yeah.
And does she ever get comments about that?
Yeah, a little bit. She used to love dressing up as Elsa.
Oh, of
but
course, yeah.
she's now just a little bit too old for that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
It's not cool to watch Frozen anymore.
Because she has beautiful hair, but also we've also talked about like how hard it is to brush, like like semi curly hair. Because my daughter's the same. What was the brush? You had to remind me though. What's the
Tangle
brush?
teaser.
I feel like we need to find one. Of those
I'll
for
look
Remy.
forward to that.
Yeah. Just grow a long beard.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
then,
I'll have a
and then
Z when you have a ZZ Top beard.
Oh
Yeah.
How does that work though? How is this brush different?
Hard hitting
I don't know
questions.
why. I think just the unique placement of the brushiness. what are they called? What are the spiky bits?
What are they?
Yeah,
Prongs
I'm thinking
or something?
in a comb, it's teeth.
Okay.
I don't know if
Yeah.
about in a brush.
Well, let's just go
Bristles?
with
Yeah.
teeth. There's
Yeah,
different
yeah.
sized teeth, and so it grabs more of the hair and different
See,
bits
that's
of the hair.
interesting.
Catherine would be able to tell you more because
Okay.
she's
We'll
the
have to get
person who
Catherine back from part
spent
2.
a couple of hours,
Yeah.
like on
Researching
just
it.
brushing hair.
Yeah.
No, just some brushing hair.
Oh,
Yeah.
so when I brush
So-
Remy's hair, it's just like, and
Yeah.
she screams at me because it hurts so much. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not even trying to hurt you. But
Yeah.
cool. That's good. I just wanted to make that connection. The rest of your family. So I know that you mentioned on the last episode that Mark Driscoll came to Australia,
Yeah.
and he talked a lot about church planning, and that was for some people hearing that was like completely almost like a new concept.
Yeah.
And that was something that you felt a calling to. So what did you do after that? Hearing, did you go see Driscoll live? Is that where?
Yeah. I went to, I think it was in 2010. Actually,
around then.
in at St Andrew's Cathedral. It was maybe even a co-branded event with MTS. I'm not sure, but that's when he delivered like this 18-point thesis.
It went pretty hard, didn't it?
Yeah.
I remember.
It did. And we'll not go into that. There was a whole ruckus that happened afterwards.
Yeah.
But I think for me, it wasn't it wasn't the rock star thing. It wasn't the rebel thing, or the reluctance thing, like in terms of me being reluctant to work in a church. By that stage, I'd already been working in church. God already opened up my eyes to his place for the church in the mission. But I was still thinking through and trying to reconcile some of my experience growing up, and particularly as a young Christian, and that was that often as churches and Christians, we really championed mission going overseas, and people contextualizing, trying new things, doing whatever it took to seek and save the lost in India or whatever it was. But when it came to mission across the street, whether it be in Ireland or in Australia, we weren't really thinking about that so much. We weren't really looking to go, how do we, the church, do that better? Now, that's not universally true of every church and every context, but in general, that's what I felt. And I just felt like God had gifted me with a passion for that, like evangelism, mission, that kind of thing. And I just couldn't reconcile how we do that. I thought that maybe church might have been a bit anti-mission. And how, what would that look like? I could have done youth ministry for the rest of my time. That would have been that would be an honourable, very, very worthwhile thing. I'm all on for people doing long-term youth ministry. But as soon as I heard Driscoll talking missionally about the church, so it doesn't really matter what he said per se, the penny just dropped. What I said before in terms of like in Peter, that the priesthood, like the royal priesthood, are to be the people that proclaim and present Jesus, that just dropped for me when I heard Driscoll talking and went, okay, maybe with the passion and the gifts that God's wired with me, I could see myself kind of doing that. So the following year, or a number of months after that, I went to a Geneva Push, which has now reached Australia, conference down in Melbourne, and it had a terrible name. Back then, it was in the very, very early days. It was called In the Chute. CHUTE shoot, like ready to plant, like probably the money shoot that you used to have in the old school kind of places. In the shoot, terrible name.
Yeah, I'd rather like In the Cannon. Or
There could be all sorts of different ways that you could put that, couldn't you? But at that conference, there were these three blokes that I've since discovered were all called Dave. That were
the three Daves,
the Daves, who were on stage talking about churches that they had planted, and they were all bawling their eyes out. They became affectionately known as the Wailing Daves. And actually, Dave, any one of those Daves, I've got no idea who you are, but if you end up listening to this, I'd love you to get in contact, because I actually don't know who these blokes were. But what I heard in the way that they spoke was that they had a deep conviction for the lost. They appeared to be people, and I think that it's true, who were gifted, they had grit, they had a tenacity, and they were trying new things for the gospel. And they were just wearing their heart on their sleeve in terms of how hard it was. And that was the moment that I felt that God was calling me to plant a church. It was kind of like, oh yeah, look at the pain that those guys are in.
That's for you.
Off you go. And I didn't, that was the very, very early stages of Geneva Push, and they had an assessment process. So I just got in contact with them. I wasn't really thinking hugely seriously about it. I just went, that just seems to be something that's on the radar. And I chatted to Cathra. I remember coming back and talking to Cathra about this thing called church planting, and she was like, hang on a minute, like, I've got no idea what that is, and I don't think I'm there with you, which was cool. That's what I love about Cathra, and she's very real on those things and helpful. But over time, so that would have been 2011, that conference, and I had already decided by that point that I wanted to go on and go to Moore College, finish doing more study, and but not really knowing what I would do after that. I continued to work as a youth and young adults pastor at that point in time, and but basically over that period of time, Geneva started assessing that, like they were already assessing people for church planting, and we just went, right, okay, well, part of the discernment process in that is, like chatting to our church, obviously, and the people that God has put in leadership around us, and then chatting to Geneva Push. So in 2013, we got assessed by Geneva Push, which was basically, it was like stripping, like metaphorically, right? Like going for that really awkward medical where, you're kind of being poked and prodded in all of the places you don't want to be poked and prodded.
She said the same thing on her podcast.
Okay, So looking into your marriage, looking into, your besetting sins, like all of these things, because they love you and they don't want you to damage your faith, your family, or actually the gospel, as you go out there. So that was quite an intense thing, but it was actually a really good thing. And through that process, then they, that they kind of affirmed that this would be something that would be a good thing for us to keep on pushing into and considering. And at that point, we had started talking to the group of churches that we were part of, the congregational churches, and we weren't sure who we were going to plant with. Mostly at that time, people were doing parachute plants. There wasn't much mother-daughter. There was mother-daughter planting that was happening, but we didn't really put that into this realm of church planting. A lot of the people that were planting were doing parachute planting, which is basically going somewhere, dropping in with nothing, and with a hope and a prayer, really, and a plan, and building it from there. So but we were trying to work out who do we connect with. Like, I had lots of connections with the Anglican, like Sydney Anglican churches. We were considered whether or not we would plant there. But through a series of conversations, God helped us to see that maybe as part of this group of churches that we were part of, that was relatively small, that God might use us to help see more churches planted and churches rejuvenated. And you know, I think it's great that we've got Anglican churches, we've got Baptist, like, you know, churches that are preaching the gospel. I think that's good because they reach different people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we decided not to jump into a big ship or whatever, but to actually be part of the existing network that we were part of and plant. But initially we thought we were going to plant in Manly.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, not because it's a nice place. Actually, I way prefer Cronulla than Manly. I'm sorry, Northern Beaches people. Yeah. The south is the most underrated kind of area in Sydney, I reckon. Because we were looking and we started to go, right, okay, God, where would we go? We actually opened up the map of Australia. When we're willing to plant anywhere. We probably thought we would be planting somewhere that was lower socioeconomic and more multicultural. But one of the distinctives or the things that we were as a couple was that we were expats.
Yeah.
And we went, right, okay, not that you pin everything on that, but in those early stages, we just went, right, okay, who are the people that we seem to be connecting with most, having the most gospel conversations with and whatever. And that's why we started thinking about Manly, Bondi, places like that, and going, right, okay, there's lots of expats here, and we might have an inroad that other people don't for the gospel. We started exploring that, but it became it was interesting. The more that we pushed into that, we even started going to a church up in Manly and whatever as well, who were very generous with us at St. Matt's. But we realized through that they probably wouldn't be the places that we would plant. And one conversation in particular, like I remember telling Toby Neal, who's the lead pastor of Vine Church in at Surrey Hills and friend of mine, and I'm kind of talking through some of this stuff with him. He had already planted, and I was like going, we're kind of like looking at Manly. Here's the here's the plan that I can kind of see in my head and whatever. But in between that, I'm talking about all of the connections and mission connections and whatever that we already have in Cronulla, where we had lived for the whole time. And he just looked at me and he said, "You're an idiot." And I was like, why aren't you thinking about planting in Cronulla?
Yeah.
And in my head, the reason for that was we thought that maybe that would just be too easy. I'm glad that you laughed at that, right? Because
it's like the three dudes crying on the stage about church playing. It's like, we don't want to take the easy option.
Yeah, that's right. It was like, but like, this is the beach. It's sunny. It's beautiful here. And we kind of just thought, we need to kind of drop into the hardest place, and we would have been willing to do that.
Yeah.
The reality is, Cronulla, the Shire, is a really hard place. It's not the Bible Belt that we think it is, that we're deluded in believing, I think. So through that conversation, then we started looking at the Shire. We went, man, there's 237,000 people here. Yeah. I reckon around about 2%, let's say, we don't need to argue over a few percent, but let's say 2% of people go to a Bible teaching church in the Shire. Yeah. That's a lot of people who don't know Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there are many great churches here. And so our motivation was not there's no good churches or those churches are doing a bad job or whatever. It was just there is a huge mission field here, and there's a whole group of people that we're struggling to reach. And I think that a new church might be best suited to reach those people and to help see more people become Christians. So we landed at that point on planting in Cronulla. And that was probably around about 2013, something like that.
A question to ask you, and it's more just out of interest, because at Soul Revival we learnt so many of the lessons we learnt through youth ministry we tried to implement in actually planning a full-blown church. Did you have any thoughts around that because you were a youth and young adult pastor prior to that?
Yeah, 100%. Like I think that one of the things that youth ministry equips you to do, whether you like it or not, I think, is to be like you're always having to change and adjust and contextualize the gospel to the next generation. And they're uniquely different. So I think that inadvertently you think missionally about how to proclaim the gospel to them and how to reach those younger and emerging generations. I think that's your concept behind, I'm pointing back here,
shock absorber.
the shock absorber. So I agree with Stu on that and with you guys on that. So you're already thinking through, how do we contextualize this? How do we take these profound truths and proclaim them in a simple but non-simplistic way that brings about deep change for the gospel? And that's effectively what you have to do when you're reaching people who have never heard about Jesus before, which we have them in the Shire, right?
Yes.
Like reality check, that's true. And that's the way that you need to think when you're planting a church. So I think it does equip you. It doesn't equip you for everything, because youth ministry is often part of a bigger ecosystem that's going on within a church. So there are things that it doesn't equip you for, but certainly that missional thinking, that having to be nimble and change and contextualize the gospel. And then probably the last thing I think is that there's such a high turnover we know in youth and kids ministry that we need leaders. Yeah. So we build teams. And we build teams that are constantly changing. So we're constantly recruiting people, constantly working out how to build teams. And a lot of churches don't have that as part of their culture in general. But to get a church plant up and off the ground, especially a parachute church, actually any church, you need people to be living out who they are and doing the things that God has set aside in advance for them to do, and serving. That's a key part of our maturity, but it's also a key part of growing as a church. So, I mean, I've kind of tied in a lot of stuff there, but I think how you deal with leaders and teams, contextualizing the gospel, and thinking missionally, those three things are really pertinent within church planting world.
Absolutely.
And what we're doing here.
Did you have a willingness to experiment as well? Or is it more just like we want to establish something? Just in Cronulla, we're going to do whatever it takes.
I had a willingness to experiment, because I think that the people that we were trying to reach, effectively what we saw, I'll just take a step back, and what we saw was that within the Shire, that there's 220,000 people who don't know Jesus, lots of churches, many Christians, but even more people who know enough about Jesus just to sidestep him, like my mum's a Catholic, or I went to church when I was a kid, that kind of thing. The question came, how do we reach people who do the Shire thing? At least it used to be the Shire thing, to move to Cronulla, and that's where you established your friendships, established fun, before moving to the inner west for a year to make sure that you were cultured, and people just moved to Cronulla. And that's right, yeah. So you move there to have fun, to be close to the beach, you house share, you're establishing yourself in your career, establishing yourself in your relationships, and then you realize you can't establish yourself in the housing market, and you start moving away. But in that age group, we kind of looked and we just went, wow, these people are in a prime time for asking big questions about life. And I just went, we want them to establish the life that they were made for. And the life that they were made for was that they were made by Jesus and for Jesus, to have a relationship with him. And we went, how do we reach those people? So that's why we went to Cronulla and not somewhere else. Was because there was a higher proportion of those people.
I'm guessing that's where you got the name of the church as well established.
Yeah, that's right. So the name established, I actually wanted to call it Established, because it was coming out of Paul's prayer for the Ephesians in Ephesians chapter 3, that you would be rooted and established in love. established in that context, like it's used 86 times in the Bible and all sorts. God established His world. He established His king, His kingdom, and He will establish His forever kingdom. That's true in Christ. But we had a vote on it, and I lost. and I think, it was actually interesting. We had a whiteboard, and we had all sorts of names on there, and people went behind the whiteboard and kind of put a tick on the things that they liked, and then we revealed it like Survivor.
The tribe has spoken,
That's
like
that's right. It was a lot of fun, and actually established was way better because it was that iterative, forward-moving kind of word. But yeah, that's why we chose there. Now, your original question.
I can't remember, but I've got a different question. If you want to go in,
I can't remember either.
How Soul Revival obviously planted with 30 people. How did you go about? You spoke about how the question was about youth ministry and how youth ministry helped you. Maybe those lessons that you learnt doing youth ministry in Engadine maybe helped you in planning. How did you go about building that launch team? Like, I'm interested in how that process was for you.
Yeah. It's interesting because we parachuted in, which meant that even though we came from the local area, even though we were part of Engadine Congregational Church, it wasn't like we were being sent. Not that they were against what we were doing by any stretch. They they commissioned us to go, but it wasn't like they said, here, take all of these people over with you. So we, like the advice at that point in time was, start with about the same size as a home group, 10 to 15 people. And I'm looking at that and going, I don't think that's right. And there was a few of us, like a couple of people that were planting around about the same time, and we were going, that just doesn't feel right. And particularly in the Shire, I reckon a couple of the cultural things that I saw was, one, that people were starting to get quite disgruntled at really big expressions of church, we're consumeristic, but we also kind of don't. There's this love-hate relationship with it, and we had a bunch of churches, that have blown up over the years in the Shire, sadly, and that has shaped the way that people think about stuff. We've also had a whole bunch of like house church type movements that we're also really suspicious of because it's quite small. And we, so I was just looking at the Shire and going, I don't think starting with 10 to 15 people is going to work to see new people coming into that group. And so we decided that we'd go for 30 people. We just plucked a figure. A couple of other of my mates were like, 50. We ended up with 17 people pre-launch or originally, and then 27 people just before we did our public launch in September 2015. How did I go about gathering those people? I was sharing the vision of this in a conversation with a couple of people, and James Warren, who's the rector at Engadine, actually said to me, and I was so surprised by this because up until this point we had a lot of opposition from our church network and also from Christians kind of going, why do we need another church in the Shire? Like everybody's Christian. And it's like, well, that's the very point. Because you believe that everybody's Christian, and it's just not true. But there's good questions in that, right? And we can come back to that if you want to. But in the midst of that, like I was just sharing the vision, and James Warren come up to me and he said, "You're right. The Shire needs more churches, and we need to be doing a heck of a lot more to reach more people. I'd love for you to come and share that vision with our church, and you can take whoever you want and whatever money they want to give you." Wow. I was just like, whoa, here is a guy, we've not known each other for that long, and just committed to the gospel vision and seeing things through the lens of the gospel. And he allowed me to come and talk to his church.
Awesome.
And he also had a couple of people who he was like, I think these people will be really good to go with you. So So that was good. So from there we had our first 2 people. So
Yeah.
vision to reality, and I just went, oh, poop. Like, it's one thing having a vision, and it's
Yeah.
one thing saying follow me, but when people start following you, it's like, oh wow, is this going to work? Like, is it?
Yeah.
Like what dreams and hopes have they got that are not?
That's a lot of responsibility too.
Yeah. That's right. But from there was 2 people, and then one of the things that we wanted to do very early on was be a church that trains and equips leaders, because of that conviction that I had that if you want to see an army of Christians, you need loads of gospel leaders who are healthy, evangelistic, and multiplying. So how do we do that? We decided to take on an MTS apprentice right at the get-go.
Yeah.
His name was James Eyre, and he was also from Engadine Anglican, although that was farther conversations from there. But as soon as those 3 people were on board, then they also recruited other people. What we said was, and in that early stage, was that we wouldn't be like, the elephant in the room with church planting is it just changes the deck chairs in the Titanic, right?
Yeah.
That's a very real problem.
Yeah.
That we start a church, that we just get people flooding from
It's just
other churches.
transfer growth rather than non-Christians.
That's right. So we had a commitment that we would ask people to come and be on mission with us from other churches up until the point that we launched.
Yeah.
And but we would actually ask their pastors. We would say, "Are you willing to see this happening for the sake of the gospel?"
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got to be careful around that, I feel.
Yeah. And I'm sure that I didn't do it perfectly, but I was very conscious of that and tried to work quite hard on that. But from there, really, it was just a matter of going, like, who are the people that you think might be interested? I would have lots of coffees with people. Mitch and Jasmine Dunn, I don't know if you guys know them, but they were part of our church for a long time. They had just got married. And married.
Sorry.
So this is a concrete example of the kind of people. So they had come from 2 different churches. They were in a transition stage. They had just got married, and they were like, "What church will we go and be part of?" And so I'm like, "Let's meet for coffee." And I met them for a coffee and convinced them to come and be part of this church plant. So it was lots of coffees, lots of sharing of the vision, lots of talking about that. So that's how we got people on the team.
We spoke a little bit about maybe the challenges of church planning, but also I think starting something, there's always a lot of excitement and joy.
100%.
Like, is there any examples or things you can think about that time of just joy and excitement and getting ready to start things?
Yeah. Everything. I loved being I loved doing what we did. There were hard moments, there were discouragements, there were challenges, but I had joy the whole way throughout that. I loved being the lead pastor of Establish. I loved thinking through that, but loved even more so seeing a bunch of people living out who they are in Christ, and working that out, not perfectly, but working that out and being courageous. So that was really cool.
Yeah.
That was really full of joy. But I think probably there's a couple of things that stick out in my mind. One was, we had this group of around about 17 people. One of them had actually just become a Christian. Like she started coming along and wasn't yet a Christian, and we were like, oh, right, okay, well, I suppose that's exactly what we're trying to do. And she became a Christian. That was joyful, because it was like, God is moving. He is doing something here. But we sent them out one day to basically go and do like walk up. Not that I'm suggesting that is a like a strategy that works or whatever. Now I think God uses it, but to do walk up and basically ask people in Cronulla some key questions about church, Jesus, etc. And everybody, they were all pretty nervous about doing that. But when they came back pumped, like going, oh, okay, like people do want to talk to us, and that just really set the trajectory of going, this is who we are, and because we want to see people come to know Jesus and grow to be more like Jesus, then we need to work out different ways that we can do that, ways that's maybe different to what we've experienced before in local churches.
Yeah,
whatever.
absolutely.
So that was cool. One of the other things that brought me a lot of joy was that we wrote and ran this evangelistic course that we called Life, or Established Life, and we did that in a third space.
Yeah.
You guys are familiar with that language. We
Yeah.
did that in a third space, in a coffee shop, in a beer hall, wherever we could go, as a way of helping people who would never walk into church before explore life's big questions. And we basically just said, we reckon that Jesus gives answers to life's big questions, and we want you to come and engage with us on it. And I remember one night we were doing it at a coffee shop just in Munro Park there, just across from the train station, and we had like people just come walking in off the street. We had a Muslim imam come in, and a Muslim imam just walking past, and he came in and was engaging with us, and all of these people coming in. And for the first time, a lot of people in our church went, wow, people are actually asking questions, and Jesus does have answers to those questions. That was a lot of joy. I loved doing that. We ran it 3 times a year consistently. So that was joyful.
That's awesome.
Very much like you've talked about your heart for mission. That's very much like being missional in that respect.
Yeah, 100%. And I feel like we hit a bit of a sweet spot with it as well, in that, really the way that the night kind of went was that we'd have tables, and there'd be 1 or 2 Christians at the table, and they would effectively be table talkers. Their job wasn't to answer questions or do that whole Christian thing where we jump in and want to try to download absolutely everything. Yeah. Their job was just really to get to know people, do similar to here, friendship, evangelism, but also to help them feel permission to ask questions. Yeah. And I'd do, there'd be some questions around the table. I'd do a 15-minute presentation, but the posture of that was, I'm not here to give you a smackdown argument about Christianity, but I want you to ask questions, and we think that Jesus has got credible answers. So let's engage on this together. And then at the end, there'd be 30 minutes of just Q&A stuff, and it was awesome. We had probably 300 odd people through that over the years. Some of them became Christians during that, or started going to church afterwards because they went, actually, there might be something in this. So it was a lot of joy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, just quickly, what location did you plant in?
So we planted in Cronulla.
Yeah.
Are you talking about building?
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So one of the problems was there were no buildings.
Yeah.
Really. I looked everywhere. I'm going into all of the real estate agents, looking, et cetera. The only place that we could get originally at first, which is a bit controversial, and I'm not sure if I would do it again necessarily, but there was an old Masonic hall, and lots of people got hang-ups about that. For me, I just went, God owns absolutely everything, and if he wants us to use a hall that has maybe been used for other purposes for the sake of the gospel, then we'll do that.
Is that the one on the Kingsway?
Yeah, just on the Kingsway there. So we started meeting there on Sundays at 4:00. By the time we hit our first birthday, we had already kind of partly outgrown that space. We started to realize that there were some people that maybe we weren't reaching because that was a barrier, and it wasn't heaps good for kids space and all of that kind of stuff. So Thomas Schmidt, the Baptist pastor in Cronulla, he was very generous and allowed us to use his building for our birthday, because we just ended up having too many people say that they were going to come along, and we went there, and then we went, man, this would be awesome to meet here every week, and he and their church was generous enough to let us meet there. So we met at Cronulla Baptist Church up until kind of midway through COVID, and that's where we had church. Yeah,
awesome.
So, because you're now coming to Soul Revival Church.
Yeah.
Just before we get to what happened with Establish, what's over those 4 years from 2015 until kind of winding it up, what was the number one highlight that you can remember?
Oh, number one. There's too many to put into number
I thought
one.
they might make it hard.
I think watching how God uses everyday Christians and the whole body to help somebody come to know Him and put their trust in Him. And I'll give you one example. A girl called Leah. She was from New Zealand, had never been to church before, but for some reason was driving up and down, I can't remember exactly why, driving up and down the east coast of New Zealand where she lived, and the only station that she could tune into was a Christian radio station.
Okay.
And she just started hearing some things that was like, putting at least a bit of intrigue on that. She moves to Australia to work for New South Wales government, and just makes basically kind of makes a little bit of friendship with a couple in our church. She came along to our summer mission thing that we called Cronulla Life, which is really just was our way of helping connect like Christians with the community, a community with church, so that we can connect them with Christ. And it was a lot of low-level kind of evangelism, really, just to connect with people who would never come in the doors of church. And she came along to that and met a lot of Christians, and she went, oh, yeah, Christians are not kind of really what I thought they were.
Yeah.
And started, then she came along to our life course as well, and she asked tough questions, you know, like she was a switched on girl, very intelligent, and she started coming along to that, then started coming along to church, then for all of those things that we had kind of put in place, one of the key things actually that, like, the moment when she became a Christian was we did communion at church, and God used that. The penny dropped for her, that Christ died for her, that He sacrificed His life for her. But when she told her story, you couldn't put it down to any one thing or any one person. Really, that journey that she had been on, it was actually the whole church. It was people getting alongside her, loving her, not turning away from her questions, showing love, helping her to belong, all of that stuff. And you know, when church does that well, that is just a beautiful, beautiful thing. So it's stories like that I think, and we had, by God's grace, quite a lot of those over the time. And sorry, I'm getting a bit emotional on that. Like, I think that, like, you know, people in the Shire, we look at them, don't we? And we don't look at them through the lens of the gospel. We see happy, healthy, shiny, perfect people, kind of. We know that they're not. But there's not much room for Jesus in that picture, is there? But the people that we're talking about, like, the thing that gives me, I suppose, wind in my sail is that we have got the good news of the gospel and eternal life, and there are people out there who are going to hell without Jesus. Like, that is the reality. So to see church and churches and Christians working out, even imperfectly, how to do that well and how to do that better, and trust in God, and that is, you know, like, that's gold.
And it's also, like, to pick up on what you're saying, and it's what I've learned through doing this podcast, is just like how God just works through every individual He calls to Him.
Yeah.
In different, like, so many different ways and in different lives. Like with this episode 101, every person's story has been different.
Yeah.
Like, every single story has been different from us originally starting this podcast up into the second part of yours.
Yeah.
It's just, they're all different. And so we're all, like, uniquely created, but all for the same purpose.
Yeah.
And God's working through those people. And it's, I think, like, in the last few years, I've become more aware of what you're saying as well, is that like, God is just at work amongst that local church community, the whole world church, whatever you want to call it. But I think I was a bit blind to that previously, and that's something we kind of started the podcast with talking about, was that kind of thing. So I'm conscious of time as well, because obviously Establish isn't a church anymore.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about that? Tell your side of the story, because I've heard Catherine's, but it probably similar to yours.
Yeah. Like I think that, you know, like there's obviously such a multifaceted thing, but one of the things that was really interesting in the journey of Establish, like we grew, we saw gospel fruit, many good things actually happening, and we're really thankful to God for that. Like around about 2018, the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, because we were choosing, or we had kind of zeroed in on a particular generation of people, not because we wanted to be just that generation of people, by the way. We actually had a vision of being all age, all stage to some degree. We weren't expressing it in the way that you guys are at this moment, but we were working towards that. Like we had a gospel community in our home that often had 8 kids in it, you know, like at least once in a time, and it was messy and beautiful and all of that kind of stuff. But because we were reaching a lot of people, and a lot of people on our team were under the age of 25, they had just hit at the same time a point in their life where they went, we can't afford to live here anymore, and you know, they're working out the price of bread and life, and kind of thinking about the future and having kids, and a bunch of them had just got married and all of that kind of stuff, and we just had this exodus of people, and none of it was bad leaving, you know, like it was people moving down to the south, moving up the north, but it all seemed to happen around about the same time. Right. Yeah. And we anticipated that would have happened, but the challenge of that was, it was all of the people that we had, or a lot of the people who we had equipped and were doing some pretty amazing things at Establish, and we were okay with the concept of sending people. That's partly what we wanted to do, but that all happened around about the same time. And I remember in that season kind of going, right, okay, who's next? In terms of that, and that took us from around about, you know, we were around about like 80. 90, something like that, like people. God had grown us to a decent number of people had become Christians. We had like 70% of people were in teams, 80% of people were in gospel communities. There were a lot of healthy indicators of deep gospel growth. Many things we weren't doing right, but then that happened, and we started going, right, okay, who's next? At our vision planning thing in 2019, we went, okay, we feel like we know what we need to do this next kind of a stage to help us get over that hurdle, because what had happened was we had dropped down to around about 70. And when you're 70 people, particularly in a place like the Shire, you need to be able to resource all of the key ministries that, you know, that will reach those people and grow Christians and whatever. And that's hard when you're at 70 people. Like resourcing that is really difficult. So we went, right, okay, we know what to do. And we started working towards that. We started to see new people joining, people have become Christians, and then COVID hit. And what that did was, at the beginning of 2020, we had around about 20 people who had been engaging with us and considering being part of Establish. They had moved new to the area, were exploring Jesus, all of that kind of stuff. They completely dropped off the radar, because once we hit like March, we couldn't really follow them up in the same way, and they didn't have any real deep relational kind of contacts. So that next kind of thing that hit was COVID, and we transcended that really quite well in many ways, but we were small, and that meant that resourcing was really quite hard, and in particular we weren't able to push into having people who would lead leaders. So that meant that when we got to the end of 2020, everything had all centered around the 3 staff that were there, and we had to go, how are we going to build again from here? Not just for the sake of growing a church, right? But because we believe in Ephesians 4:11, we believe that people have got things that they're to do, that part of being a Christian is serving, and that our job is to help equip the saints, not just to do, we don't do everything. That's actually unhealthy for the church. So because of that conviction, we went, right, okay, what do we need to do? We started doing that, then 2021 happened, and that seemed to hit I think Australians way worse than 2020.
Yeah.
And people were already quite exhausted by then. Lots of people had jobs that were impacted, all of that kind of stuff. Fast forward to the end of 2021, and we were maybe around about 50 kind of adults, something like that. We had still seen people become Christians. We had regular mission contacts, and I remember at our vision weekend going, right, okay, the last 3-4 years, there's always been something that has, that has kind of disrupted our plans. What's it going to be this time? And literally that night, I got a phone call about my mum, who had then since discovered that her cancer was inoperable. And, I was on the phone with her. We continued to do our weekend, and went, right, okay, if we're going to see establish flourishing and getting to the point of sustainability, where we can be a church that's going to keep on training leaders, church planting, doing all of that stuff, then we actually need the leaders that we've currently got in place, like as in the paid staff, because they'll be the people that will raise up more leaders. But by that point, we were kind of a bit overstaffed, and we had to take a risk on, like a measured gospel risk on resourcing going ahead with 2.1 staff members. Now that's very technical. Sorry about that, but that was a very, very key decision that we made. We just didn't know at that point that I was going to have to end up going over to Ireland, which we did on the 15th of December. We didn't know that Omicron was going to hit exactly the same time as that, and that wiped out all of that mission flow that we had at the beginning of the year. It wiped people out emotionally in a whole bunch of different ways. And we thought we were going to be in Ireland for 6 weeks. We ended up being there for nearly 6 months. And that was really, really tough for our church in that moment. It was really, really tough to work that out. And that wasn't the reason that we ended up having to close. But it certainly was a really difficult moment for our church. Omicron had hit. People were tired. We were struggling to do any of the things that we needed to do to reach the people that we were on about, and we didn't want to just not do that. You know what I mean? Like we started because people needed to be reached for the gospel, and then we also discovered that a lot of the people who used to join our church at the beginning of the year would be from new areas moving in. That what we saw was post-COVID, people wanted comfort. They wanted, and I'm not saying that pejoratively, but they wanted everything in place. They wanted, like they had just been through a war, effectively, and they wanted a bit more comfort. And we couldn't offer that. We couldn't offer kids youth ministry the whole way through, and say we were saying, hey, come and help us build it. So we just couldn't have confidence that we would see that growth happening the way that it normally was happening. We also we also were looking at our church family and going, people are tired. They don't have the same resilience as what they had at the start. We don't have that startup momentum. And the big fear was, and this is really, really hard because there's nothing in the Bible about this, right, in terms of what are the markers and indicators of closing a church. But the real big fear was that we would go, oh yeah, let's run to next year. Let's give it a red hot crack, throw everything at it. That could have actually burnt people out and blown up what we were doing. Now, I'm not saying that, like there's going to be all sorts of times in church life where people do burn out or whatever. We need to do hard things for the gospel, but we need to be living sacrifices, not dead ones. But I looked at that and went, this is, like the Shire doesn't need another church bust up or blow up. We don't need these people who God has grown to become disgruntled with the mission. That would actually be counterproductive to that bigger vision that we had. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in the middle of this, but we basically looked at it and went, we think that the best thing for the gospel is that we commission our church to go out and be part of other churches and take that DNA, I suppose, or that heart conviction that they had of mission in that place. And so that's why ultimately we decided, like we just went, we can't see finances getting better. It's going to take another year or two before we get momentum of mission and stuff back again. People are tired. We want to love them well. But the hardest thing about all of that is that this is your family.
Yeah.
This is a spiritual reality. It's not closing down an organization or a club. These are people who love Jesus, people who love each other, and we love them as well deeply. So it was really, really hard conclusion to come to. But yeah, but ultimately that's the broad brushstrokes. There was lots of things that happened in between that as well.
Well, I just appreciate the way you're approaching it. Like, there's a lot of humility in the way that I think you're talking about it. And I think the question that I was going to ask you was, you felt that God had called you to do it.
Yeah.
Was it a bit of a blow to your identity as a church planner, having to do that?
Yeah. It could have been a bigger blow than what it was. In a sense.
That's how I feel.
Yeah. So one of my biggest fears is failure, right? Imposter syndrome, all of that kind of stuff. And when you put yourself out there and do something that's really hard, there's always a risk of failing, right? But we need to determine what failure looks like and actually ask that from a gospel point of view. That's maybe for another podcast. We can dig into that. But for me, it wasn't so much about my identity per se, but it was more that, it was a little bit. I'll get to that in a second. It was more that we had kind of called people to do this thing that we believed in, and the thought of disappointing people, the impact that could have had relationally on people, for the gospel, their souls, all of that kind of stuff. That was probably the biggest concern for me, and I remember. I remember when I was in Ireland, I don't know if I told you guys this story on the last podcast or not. If I did, just cut me short. But I remember this moment where I'm lying in bed. So I knew that Mum was she was gonna die. That was obvious. We had to extend our trip because Mum got taken into hospital, and we went, man, we can't not stay at this moment. She's probably only got a couple of weeks to live, all of that kind of stuff. And when I remember just lying in bed at night, and I'm like bawling my eyes out uncontrollably, deep hurt. I described it to Catherine like the Holy Spirit just taking hot knives and gouging out all of this stuff. Some of that was because of grief. Some of that was because of just trauma from the past, all of that kind of thing. But then along with it was just this deep, profound sense that I was letting people down and whatever by being there. And the only thing that stopped me from crying was Catherine scratching my back and feeding me Indian curry at like 3 a.m. And but that moment, and then the moment that we finally said, we feel like God is calling us to stay here, and we know the possible impact of that at home. That was really hard, but we couldn't have made any other decision. Like, there's very few times in my life where it's been so clear what God wants us to do, and that was one of them. You going to ask a question there? Or
No.
So I think that was really difficult. My biggest concern over that whole period of time was just was people and our family. And once we got to the point where like mum had passed away, we came back. The big thing for me was just going, where's people's hearts at? Forget about finances for a moment. That's really important. That is a gospel issue. But where are people's hearts at? Do they, are they growing in Jesus? Are they wanting to continue kind of doing this thing? All of that kind of stuff. And I remember having a conversation with the leaders at Establish and going, it looks like this is this is the best course of action. We could never have been 100% certain, but you have to lead in those moments, right? And trust God. And that felt like the exact same conversation that I had with my family around my mum's funeral. And that might be because there was a little bit of an overemphasis on, what was going on at church, but I don't think it was. I think that was the weight of the fact that this is a spiritual reality. This is a family. These are people that we love and whatever. So I do think that was my biggest concern. Probably the fear about my identity came afterwards, when it was like, well, what do I do next? And it's like, and who's going to want to employ, who's going to want to employ me? As your pastor, and we'll, close the church in a couple of years. And I did have that bit of a moment of existential crisis. I was burnt out. I was kind of struggling from a lot of things that were from my past that came up whilst I was in Northern Ireland, and God just came around me in that moment. The whole way along, He said to me, Lee, I've got you. I've got your family here. I've got your family at Establish. And He did, even though we closed, right? He did have people. And that just became very, very clear to me. And in particular, Romans 8, you're no longer a child of fear, but you're a child of God, right? That became so real to me, as well as Paul saying that Christ's power is made complete in our weakness. I felt weak. I couldn't change the outcome in any of that. So to be brought to a point where God humbles you, where you don't just get to say, I trust you in everything, but you actually just experience it and have to. That will change has changed the trajectory of how I walk with Jesus, how I husband, father, pastor, plant, do mission, whatever it might be. Because it's true, God does have you. So I think that moment was really buffeted by that truth and by God's grace speaking that into me, really.
Many of those things that you said there make me think of the gospel is regenerative too. You have to go through really difficult times at some point in your life. And I'm sad that Established didn't keep going, but I'm really encouraged by the way that you went in first and said you could have held on to it and go, I want this to continue. I think there's a lot of humility in saying maybe this isn't the right time for that, but then knowing that God's going to keep going, which is going to help you keep going.
And Joel, if I can just say in that as well, it's one thing talking about something retrospectively, right? In a context like this, you can't get all of the color that goes on. But I wasn't with the picture, on that for a long time. But a deep conviction that I had was that I'm not the king. I'm not, we started Established, but it wasn't really about me. We handed on responsibility really, really early. And I always said that our team, which included Catherine, my wife, Tim Foskett, his wife Hope, and whatever, I said to them, look, if at any moment that you feel like God is going, we don't think we should continue this thing, then I want to know. And I want to hear that, because God doesn't just work through me. He works through his spirit-filled leaders and people who are armed with the word. And that was a deep conviction of mine. But I went away for a couple of weeks because I was a bit burnt out, and I came back raring to go and going, I can strategize. I can, I can work this out, right? And we can trust God. Not, we would have to do that profoundly. And I came back and I said, hey guys, where are you? What are you thinking? And they're all going, no, we don't think that's the case. And I was, that floored me, in a good way, and it also was really, really helpful. But I had to fight with that, and I had to wrestle with that deeply. And even up until the moment when we were kind of communicating to establish, like we basically called our church to like a month of praying and discerning, and we gave permissions. You know, we said, look, if you think that this is pushing and driving it too much, so we created a plan. We said, here's how we think we can get out of this, but to do that, we need to be able to do these things. And we spent a long time praying about that. When it got to the moment where it was, we can't see, you know, this thing going forward, I got a call from somebody who said, I'll give you pretty much the exact amount of money that we might have needed to journey that 6 months, 8 months, right? Many other variables in that. And I just went, oh man, like this is what God does, right? Yeah. Like he comes in at the last minute sometimes and he provides. And that really rocked me. Mm-hmm. That really, really rocked me, because I said to Cathra, I don't think I can say with hand on heart that we need to close because of money, because we've got this promise of money. We need to work out what are the other reasons that we would do. And we just prayed through everybody. Like we got the list of people out. We prayed, we pleaded with God. We did that. And in the end, it was Cathra, you know, but God through Cathra kind of helped me to then finally go, okay, this is what it is, and actually come to accept that. So I just wanted to make that clear, because it sounds like I'm this uber kind of like humble, had it together kind of, you know, like, oh man, it was a bumpy ride.
Yeah, it would have been.
And it was a lot of tough questions in that. Have you noticed how I'm not really answering any of your questions directly?
That's the point.
So, maybe I should get into politics.
I suppose it's just
being a pastor.
Worth coming to the end, obviously. That we haven't asked the last question that we always ask, which is, and I mean, there's so many things that you've shared, which I really appreciate.
Yeah.
If you can remember the last episode as well, what do you know now as a Christian that you wish you knew when you were a younger Christian?
Yeah. Can I do two things? I don't like sticking to the rules. So one.
This is a pretty ruleless podcast.
One thing is that if we want to grow to be more like Jesus, we have to grow deep, and to grow deep, we have to allow God to do some pretty deep work through His Spirit. In our lives, deep recessed fears, the deep areas in our heart where the gospel just hasn't shone a light in, the deep things that we don't tell people. And often I think that happens through suffering and pain, where we learn big lessons on trusting God. And I think that we live in a culture where we try to avoid pain at all costs, whether that be low-level pain of joining a new church community and going through all, like, you know, I mean, this is what we're in at the moment, right? Like, it's been an awesome journey for us at Soul Revival. This is our home. We love it here. But it takes commitment and hard work to graft into another community, you know, like, but God uses that, right? But then those bigger, deeper moments. So I prayed, I like in just before COVID, just before this stuff with like mum, I was praying, hey God, help me to grow to be more like Jesus. I had this vision. This sounds like I'm really A-type. I'm not really, but I wanted to be more faithful, fruiter, fitter, and fun in my 40s. Those were my four kind of goals. And hey, God has done that through some pretty big things. Yeah. Having to close down a church, the potential of my identity being so wrapped up in that I maybe couldn't continue doing ministry or whatever it might be. So I think I wish that I would have known how God uses, as you grow older as a Christian, and all of the superficial stuff that the Spirit convicts you of, you know, like as you start to sort some of that stuff out, not always, then I think that other growth is a deep growth. And you've got to have courage and trust, I think. Courage to face up to the things that God is putting before you when you hit up against your limits and those tough moments, those moments where you're just confronted by your sin, but then a trust that actually you are not loved by God based on your performance, but based on who you are in him. That's been the big thing that I've learned on this, because I couldn't do anything, and that was okay, because I could trust God, and that's exactly what I needed to do. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the gospel, like man, there are 24 million people in Australia lost outside of Jesus. People who haven't heard the gospel, they think they have. People in the Shire think they have heard the gospel. They haven't. Many of them haven't. And I think that I wish I would have known how difficult it was to continually kind of live that out, you know, as you go through the different stages in life. But the thing that I've learned through this process is that, or through what God has done, is that actually failure is not. It's not a bad thing.
It's not what we think it is, at least.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And you know, like I don't think Established was a failure. We failed to achieve the plan that we wanted to achieve, 100%. But I don't think that was a failure in the gospel. What would have been a huge failure was that we stopped following Jesus, that our marriage broke up, that, you know, people were blowing up, you know, like metaphorically. But you know, like that by God's grace, that wasn't the case. And it would also be a real failure, I think, if we pulled back from the mission. Not that God needs me uniquely, but he's made me for that.
Yep.
He's made me to be the person who proclaims and presents Jesus, you know, like in whatever way. And that's for all Christians. That's not just for pastors. He has given us gifts to serve him on his mission. And that's a huge privilege. And we do that in the day of salvation, like Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians. You know, now is the day of salvation. We're to proclaim Jesus, call people to be reconciled to God. And I wish I knew what that would have looked like as a younger guy, as a younger Christian, because I think I might have tried some more hard things, but the fear of failure was holding me back. Yeah.
And you can understand that, like, from where you came from, but also it's exciting to see, like, the person that God's made you to be, and then as we've said already, he works through all of us. And I think when you're talking about Established, and you said it was, you know, we talked. I thought you approached it with a lot of humility, and you said, well, having said that, it was really messy. That just shows there's humility in that anyway. So, but again, like, it sounds like you've learnt so much through that as well. God's taught you a lot through that. That it's still really. There would have been some really, really tough parts of it, but there's some really, like we talked about, joyful moments as well. Like even through all the sadness and the heartache, and it sounds like you still found things that were actually really, really good about it too.
Yeah,
and I think that's really special.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, look, my last sermon at Establish was asking the question, was it worth it? We were looking at Revelation 4 and 5, particularly 4:11. You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive all honor, glory, and power, because you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being. That's about one of the only memory verses that I remember. But like, I asked the question that everybody probably would have been scared to ask, which was it worth it? Yeah. We threw so much time, energy, money, people towards this thing, and it closed. You know, like we poured our heart and soul into it, like as in everybody, not just us. And I think that there was this story that came up in that from a missionary called Helen Roseveare, and she lived in Northern Ireland. She was a doctor. I can't remember what country, but it was in Africa. She basically said that the question that I always asked myself was, is it worth it? You know, is it worth me investing time in medicine? Is it worth me doing this? And she got to the point where all of her life's work in a day was pretty much burnt up. She was beaten, raped, teeth kicked out, tied to a post. Because of the work that she was doing, and they brought out all of her memoirs, all of the stuff that was kind of recording her work and the work of the gospel in that area, and they set light to it.
Wow.
In front of her. And actually, interesting, that was worse for her than the other physical things that had happened. And she tells this story. You can actually go onto YouTube and hear her talking about this. But she basically said, you know, like asked the question that I always asked, and the question was, is it worth it? Was this worth it? And she said that God came along and said at that moment, Helen, that's not the right question. The question is, am I worthy? Am I worthy? And that's what we get in Revelation 4:11, right? He is worthy of absolutely all of our life and more. And for me, then that means that, you know, Jesus was completely worthy of all of the work, blood, sweat, and tears that we did for him and more. And he is worthy of us trying to graft into other churches and plant more churches. So, you know, like I came away from that going out, yeah, we would do that again. We would plant another church again. We would do that. And so I think that was the final thing. He is worthy of absolutely everything.
And I think actually it's a really good way to wrap up the episode. It was perfect. Any final words, Braden, before we finish?
Oh, just thank you, Lee. It's a pleasure, privilege, blessing to hear about how God has worked early in your life, throughout your whole life, obviously, throughout established, especially, and now going on to the future with MTS and wherever you end up. It's a blessing to hear about how mission-hearted you are, how much you love the gospel, and how much you love sharing that with other people. So thank you.
Thank you. And it's a real blessing for me, I think, and our family being at Soul Revival Church.
Guys.
And going, how do we, you know, like we're just normal Christians. We're part of this church, but how do we use those things that God has gifted us in and wired us in to love and serve the people here in the Shire, and that's a real joy. I thought that would have been harder than what it was.
That's nice.
To effectively give myself to somebody else's mission and vision, but actually it's all God's mission and vision.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's what it's about. So but you guys have made that really easy and a real joy for us. It's been great.
Nice. Yeah. I'll echo Braden. It's been a pleasure having you on in 2 parts.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for coming. Thank you to everyone that's been listening. And we're going to finish this Chip on Through the one way, as always. One way.
One way. That's good.